In the summer of 1820, the doors of the House of Lords were thrown open for the most sensational trial in British history. A queen stood accused of adultery, and the entire nation was watching. But the man who rose to defend her, a brilliant and ruthless Scottish lawyer named Henry Brougham, held a secret so dangerous it could have destroyed the British monarchy itself. He didn't just defend Queen Caroline of Brunswick. He blackmailed a king. He threatened to expose a lie that had been hidden for 35 years. And in doing so, he turned a courtroom into a battlefield that nearly tore the country apart. To understand how it all happened, we need to go back to a wedding night that ended in disgust, and a marriage that should never have taken place at all. In the winter of 1794, somewhere inside the gilded walls of Carlton House in London, George, Prince of Wales, made a deeply cynical decision. He agreed to marry a woman he had never met, never spoken to, and never wanted. Not for love, not for duty, not for anything noble or romantic. He agreed to marry for money. By the age of 32, the Prince of Wales had accumulated personal debts exceeding £600,000, a sum so vast it would equal tens of millions today. He had spent recklessly and without restraint. Palaces, paintings, mistresses, gambling, banquets that lasted until dawn. George had indulged every appetite a man could have, and now the bills had arrived, and he could not pay them. Parliament had delivered its ultimatum in language that even a prince could understand. If George wanted the government to clear his debts and increase his annual allowance, he would take a wife. She would be Protestant. She would be royal, and the wedding would happen immediately. There was just one problem with this arrangement. George was already married. 9 years earlier, on the evening of December 15th, 1785, inside the candlelit drawing room of a Mayfair townhouse, the Prince of Wales had secretly married the love of his life, a Catholic widow named Maria Fitzherbert. She was born Maria Ann Smythe in 1756. The daughter of an old Catholic family in Hampshire. She was 6 years older than George, twice widowed, her first husband dying within a year of their wedding, her second dying in 1781, leaving her comfortably wealthy and strikingly beautiful. She moved in the highest circles of London society, and when the Prince of Wales reportedly first saw her, around 1784, he is said to have become consumed with a passion that defied all reason. George pursued Maria with a desperation that alarmed everyone who witnessed it. She refused to be his mistress. Her Catholic faith would not allow it. In response, George reportedly staged a suicide attempt, either stabbing himself with a knife or pretending to, collapsing in a theatrical display of anguish, until Maria, horrified and manipulated, agreed to consider his proposal. She fled to the continent, spending months in Antwerp, France and Switzerland, hoping his obsession would cool. It did not. George wrote her frenzied letters, referring to her as his wife, promising to find a way to marry her legally. Back in London, he spiraled, appearing drunk in public, racking up debts, and alienating his father, the king. Eventually, worn down by his persistence, Maria returned. The ceremony was performed by Robert Burt, an impoverished Church of England curate, who set aside his scruples for a fee of £500. 2 witnesses stood in the drawing room. The marriage was real in the eyes of God and the couple, but it was illegal in every way that mattered. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 required the king's consent for any prince under 25, and George had never asked. More critically, the Act of Settlement barred any heir who married a Catholic from inheriting the throne. If this marriage was ever made public, George could lose his claim to the crown itself. For nearly a decade, George and Maria lived as husband and wife in everything but official recognition. They shared residences in Brighton and London, entertained together, appeared in public together, and were accepted as a couple by much of fashionable society. Half of London knew, everyone pretended they didn't. Now, in 1794, drowning in debt and cornered by his own extravagance, George agreed to set Maria aside and marry his father's chosen bride, his first cousin, Princess Caroline of Brunswick. 3,000 miles away, in a small German duchy, a young woman was about to have her entire future destroyed by a decision she had played absolutely no part in making. Caroline Amelia Elizabeth was born on May 17, 1768, in Braunschweig, Germany. Her father was Charles William Ferdinand, Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, a respected military commander. Her mother was Princess Augusta of Great Britain, the elder sister of King George III himself. This made Caroline a direct cousin of the man she was being sent to marry. Her childhood was not happy. Her parents lived openly separate lives. Her father installed a permanent mistress at court during the late 1770s, a humiliation that Caroline's mother never forgave and never forgot. Young Caroline was caught in the middle, shuffled between two resentful parents, used as a pawn in their private war. It shaped her. She became bold, defiant, and startlingly outspoken. She once pretended to go into labor, screaming so loudly that the entire palace staff came running, simply because she had been forbidden from attending a ball. That was Caroline. She did not go quietly. Her education was basic. Governesses taught her what they could, but she was no scholar. Music was one of the few subjects where she received advanced instruction. She could speak English and French, but her spelling was poor. She preferred to dictate rather than write. She was barely permitted to socialize with men her own age, and was not allowed to dance until she was in her 20s. By 1794, at the age of 26, Caroline may have begun to fear she would never marry at all. When word arrived that the Prince of Wales wanted her hand, she may have felt her luck had turned at last. It had not. The first time George laid eyes on his future wife was on April 5, 1795, 3 days before the wedding. Lord Malmesbury, the diplomat who had been sent to Germany to escort the princess to England, presented Caroline to the prince at St. James's Palace. The scene that followed became a widely retold moment in royal history. George took one look at Caroline. His face changed. He turned to Malmesbury and spoke the words that would echo through the centuries. "Harris, I am not well. Pray, get me a glass of brandy." Then he walked to the far end of the room and did not come back. Caroline, who had been expecting the handsome prince from his flattering portraits, was confronted instead with a bloated, overdressed man who smelled of alcohol and could barely bring himself to look at her. She turned to Malmesbury and whispered that her future husband was considerably fatter than his paintings suggested. The insult was mutual, the dislike was instant, and the wedding was in 3 days. On April 8, 1795, George and Caroline were married at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. The ceremony was a catastrophe. The groom was visibly, staggeringly drunk. He wept openly throughout the service, not from happiness, but from despair. At several points during the vows, he seemed on the verge of walking out. His father, King George III, had to physically urge him forward. The reception afterward was excruciating. George sat in sullen silence. Caroline attempted conversation and was ignored. The entire court pretended not to notice. The wedding night was worse. Caroline later described it in blunt, unforgettable terms. Her new husband, she said, collapsed into the fireplace in a drunken stupor. She left him there on the floor and went to bed alone. At some point in the days that followed, they managed, however reluctantly, to do their royal duty. 9 months later, on January 7, 1796, Princess Charlotte Augusta was born, a healthy girl who would become the most beloved member of the royal family. Charlotte's birth should have brought the couple together. Instead, it was the end. Within weeks of the delivery, George and Caroline separated permanently. George made no secret of his contempt. He would later tell people that he would rather see vipers crawling over my victuals than sit at the same table as his wife. Caroline was exiled to Montague House in Blackheath, a modest residence far from the glitter of Carlton House and Brighton Pavilion. Her daughter was taken from her care and placed with a governess, though Caroline was permitted regular visits. She was 27 years old. She was alone. She was publicly humiliated. And the man who was supposed to be her husband was already back in the arms of his mistresses. But Caroline was not the kind of woman who sat quietly in a corner and wept. Abandoned by the most powerful man in England, the Princess of Wales was about to do something that would turn the entire British establishment against her. And somewhere in Edinburgh, a teenage prodigy named Henry Brougham was beginning a journey that would make him the most feared lawyer in Britain, and the only man willing to stand between a queen and a king who wanted her destroyed. Alone at Blackheath, Caroline did not withdraw from the world. She built her own world instead. She gathered around her a strange, eclectic court of artists, minor politicians, and social outcasts. Anyone who was amusing, anyone who was interesting, anyone who didn't care about the disapproval of Carlton House. Her gatherings were loud, boisterous, and frequently indiscreet. She flirted openly. She laughed too loudly. She wore dresses that shocked the sensibilities of the era. In the suffocating world of Regency propriety, Caroline was a scandal waiting to happen. The Prince of Wales watched from a distance, and he was furious. In 1806, George launched his first formal attack. Rumors had been swirling for years that Caroline had taken lovers and had secretly given birth to an illegitimate son, a boy named William Austen, whom she had adopted as an infant in 1802. George's allies seized on the gossip, and a friend of the couple, Lady Charlotte Douglas, one of Caroline's own neighbours, told George that Caroline had confided the boy was truly hers. The prince convened what became known as the Delicate Investigation, a secret committee of the Privy Council, tasked with determining whether the Princess of Wales had committed adultery and borne an illegitimate child. It was the first formal attempt to destroy her. The result was mixed. The investigation found no foundation for the claim that William Austen was Caroline's biological child, but it also concluded that her behavior had been recklessly indiscreet. The legal charges were dropped, but the reputation damage was done. Caroline emerged technically innocent, but publicly stained, exactly what George had intended. It was around this time, the years of the Delicate Investigation and its aftermath, that Henry Brougham entered Caroline's life. Brougham was born on September 19, 1778, in Edinburgh, Scotland, the eldest son of Henry Brougham of Brougham Hall in Westmoreland and Eleanor Syme, daughter of a Scottish minister. He was a weak, sickly child who suffered from what doctors called putrid fever, but his mind was extraordinary from the beginning. At 14, Brougham entered the University of Edinburgh. While still a student, barely older than a schoolboy, he presented a paper on the physics of light to the Royal Society of London. It was a feat that would have been remarkable for a seasoned professor. For a teenager, it was astonishing. He first studied science and mathematics, but the law drew him in. He was called to the Scottish bar in 1800 and quickly discovered that the courtroom suited his talents, not because he was a brilliant legal scholar, but because he was a devastating speaker. Judges found him irritating, opponents found him terrifying. He argued with a theatrical ferocity that turned every case into a drama. In 1802, Brougham and a group of friends founded the Edinburgh Review, a quarterly periodical with a fierce Whig political slant. In its first 2 years, Brougham personally contributed 35 articles. The publication became one of the most influential in Britain, and Brougham used it as a weapon, attacking the Tory government, championing social reform, and building a reputation as the sharpest pen in the country. By 1803, his ambitions had outgrown Edinburgh. He moved to London, joined Lincoln's Inn, and in 1808 was called to the English bar. 2 years later, he entered Parliament. He lost his seat in 1812 after championing the abolition of slavery, an unpopular position in the port city of Liverpool, where he stood for election. But he returned in 1815 as MP for Winchelsea and quickly resumed his position as one of the most forceful voices in the House of Commons. In 1828, he would deliver a 6-hour speech in the Commons, the longest ever made in that chamber. He was, by many accounts, a man of remarkable energy and ambition. He was not handsome. Contemporaries described him as physically unremarkable, sharp-featured, thin, with an intensity that could be unsettling, but what he lacked in looks, he compensated for in charisma and force of personality. He spoke with the confidence of someone who rarely lost an argument. According to biographers, Brougham and Caroline first met around 1809. By 1812, he had become her chief legal advisor, a role that bound their fates together for the next decade. The question is, why did Brougham take her on? The answer reveals everything about the man. Caroline was not simply a wronged woman in need of a lawyer. She was a political weapon. Her cause was the Whig cause. When Caroline was attacked by the Crown, the Tory government often faced embarrassment. When she was defended, the Whigs often scored political points. Public sympathy for the abandoned princess could be converted directly into political pressure. And Henry Brougham was exactly the kind of man who understood this calculation perfectly. He was her advisor, her strategist, her shield. But he was also a man whose first loyalty often appeared to be his own career. Their partnership was genuine, but it was never equal. Caroline needed Brougham to survive. Brougham needed Caroline to rise. In 1814, tired of the surveillance, the isolation, and the endless whispering campaigns, Caroline made the decision that changed everything. She left England. She traveled across Europe, through her native Brunswick, through Switzerland, and finally south into Italy, where the warmth and freedom intoxicated her. And it was in Italy that she met the man who would hand her enemies the weapon they needed. His name was Bartolomeo Pergami. He was tall, dark, strikingly handsome, and around 30 years old, a former soldier who had served under General Pino during Napoleon's catastrophic Russian campaign of 1812. He had survived the frozen retreat from Moscow, which had killed hundreds of thousands of men, and had returned to Italy with nothing but his good looks and a soldier's toughness. When Caroline met him, he was working as a courier, essentially a glorified messenger. She hired him on the spot. Within months, he had risen from courier to secretary to head of her entire household. Within a year, according to virtually every account, he was sharing her bed. She purchased the beautiful Villa d'Este on the shores of Lake Como and turned it into a private paradise. Pergami was installed as the master of the house. His sister became Caroline's lady-in-waiting. His brother, his mother, and his daughter were all given positions. Every member of his family was brought in, except, with pointed deliberateness, his wife. Caroline then did something even more reckless. She bought Pergami a baronial title, elevating a former servant to the minor nobility so that he could accompany her in the rigid, class-obsessed social circles of European courts. Even Lord Byron, who was himself no stranger to scandal, took notice and wrote about the couple. They traveled the Mediterranean together, like a king and queen in exile, through Italy, the Greek islands, Constantinople, Jericho, and Jerusalem. Witnesses reported them sleeping together on the deck of a ship under a shared tent. They were seen bathing together. Caroline was spotted driving through the streets of Genoa in a gown cut so low that it shocked even the Italians. Their affair was an open secret, and back in London, Henry Brougham knew every detail. In March 1819, his brother James visited Caroline in Italy and wrote to Henry with the blunt assessment that Caroline and Pergami were clearly in an adulterous relationship. Caroline even suggested to James a willingness to admit as much, arguing that George was just as guilty of adultery as she was. Brougham absorbed the information and filed it away. He knew that if the scandal ever went to trial, he would have to defend a woman whose guilt was almost certainly real. That didn't concern him. What concerned Brougham was winning. because George was building his own case. In August 1818, the Prince Regent had appointed a three-man commission, the Milan Commission, to investigate Caroline's conduct abroad. Agents and spies fanned out across Italy, bribing servants, collecting sworn testimony, compiling a dossier of evidence designed to prove Caroline's adultery beyond any reasonable doubt. The trap was being set, and then, on January 29, 1820, everything changed. King George III, the old, blind, and mentally broken monarch, died at Windsor Castle. The Prince Regent became King George IV, and Caroline of Brunswick, the woman he despised more than anyone on earth, was now officially Queen of England. What happened next would ignite the greatest constitutional crisis since the English Civil War. George IV's first priority as king was not his coronation. It was not the business of government, or diplomacy, or the wars still raging across the globe. His first priority was getting rid of his wife. He wanted a divorce. He wanted Caroline stripped of her title. He wanted her name removed from the prayers said in every church in Britain. He wanted her to cease to exist, legally, socially, and publicly. And he was prepared to use every instrument of the state to make it happen. Prime Minister Lord Liverpool and his government were deeply reluctant. They knew that putting the Queen on trial for adultery would be a political disaster. George's own conduct, the illegal marriage to Fitzherbert, the parade of mistresses, the obscene debts, would be dragged into the light. But George was implacable. He demanded action. In the spring of 1820, the government sent a delegation to intercept Caroline, who was on her way back to England from Italy. During the weekend of June 3 to 4, Lord Hutchinson and Henry Brougham met with Caroline in the French town of St. Omer. They brought a remarkable offer, £50,000 a year, a fortune by any standard, in exchange for Caroline giving up her claim to the title of Queen and remaining permanently abroad. If she refused, they warned, she would face prosecution for adultery. Caroline listened. She considered. Then she looked at Brougham, who understood perhaps better than anyone the political value of her defiance. She refused. On June 5, 1820, Caroline of Brunswick landed at Dover, and the reaction was unlike anything the government had anticipated. Thousands of people lined the roads from the coast to London. Crowds surrounded her carriage, cheering, weeping, throwing flowers, and pressing forward to touch the sides of the coach. By the time she reached the capital, the streets were so packed with her supporters that soldiers could not clear a path. She had become the most popular person in England, not because the public necessarily believed she was innocent, but because they despised George IV with a passion that bordered on revolutionary fervor. He was fat, he was wasteful, he was cruel. He had spent the nation's money on palaces and mistresses, while ordinary people struggled. Caroline, for all her flaws, was the underdog, the wife who had been thrown away, exiled, and now hunted. In the volatile, class-conscious atmosphere of post-Napoleonic Britain, her cause was the people's cause. On July 5, 1820, the government introduced the Bill of Pains and Penalties into the House of Lords. This was not a normal divorce proceeding. The Pains and Penalties Bill was a parliamentary mechanism that could establish wrongdoing without the formal standards of evidence required in a court of law. If passed and given royal assent, it would strip Caroline of her title as queen and dissolve the marriage entirely. The charge was devastating in its simplicity. Caroline had carried on an adulterous affair with Bartolomeo Pergami, a man of low birth, and had therefore forfeited her right to be queen. On August 17, 1820, the proceedings began. Virtually every peer, bishop, and judge in the realm was required to attend. The House of Lords was transformed into a courtroom. Sir George Hayter captured the extraordinary scene in a massive painting, now in the National Portrait Gallery, showing hundreds of wigged and robed lords crammed into the chamber, with Caroline herself seated near the bar, dignified, composed, and defiant. The prosecution built its case on the testimony of Italian witnesses, servants, maids, and attendants, who had been tracked down by the Milan Commission. Many had been paid to travel to London and testify. They described Caroline and Pergami sleeping in the same room, bathing together, sharing a tent on the deck of a ship, and living as man and wife across Italy, Greece, and the Holy Land. One of Caroline's Italian servants claimed to demonstrate an exotic dance before the assembled lords. The chamber alternated between scandalized silence and barely suppressed laughter. A former maid, Louisa de Mont, provided testimony about what she had witnessed inside Caroline's private rooms. She described intimate arrangements, shared sleeping quarters, and conversations that suggested a relationship far beyond that of an employer and a servant. The prosecution built its narrative carefully, layer upon layer of testimony designed to paint a picture of a woman who had abandoned every standard of royal conduct and was living openly in sin with a man of low birth. The star prosecution witness was Theodore Majocchi, a former manservant who had been hired by Pergami himself. Majocchi provided detailed, graphic testimony about what he had witnessed between Caroline and her lover. But when Henry Brougham rose to cross-examine him, the prosecution's case began to disintegrate. Brougham tore into Majocchi's testimony with surgical precision. He asked specific questions about dates, locations, and details. Again and again, Majocchi's response was the same: "Non mi ricordo," I don't remember. The phrase became a national sensation. It was printed on pamphlets, painted on signs, scrawled on walls, and shouted in the streets of London. "Non mi ricordo" became the punchline that turned the prosecution's star witness into a figure of ridicule. The public concluded that if the government's best evidence came from a man who couldn't remember anything, the entire case was built on lies. On October 3, 1820, Henry Brougham delivered a speech that gained him significant recognition. It lasted 2 full days. He began by systematically dismantling the prosecution's evidence. The Italian witnesses were unreliable. Their testimony contradicted itself at critical points. Many had been paid, some generously, by the Milan Commission. The entire case, Brougham argued, was the product of a conspiracy. A king who wanted to replace his wife, backed by a government willing to bribe foreign servants and parade them before Parliament. He presented letters, including correspondence from King George III, suggesting Caroline had been respected by the royal family. He showed that Louisa de Mont, a key prosecution witness and Caroline's former maid, had written private letters that directly contradicted her testimony. When confronted with these letters on the stand, de Mont had claimed they were written in double entendre for her sister, a defense so weak it collapsed under its own weight. But Brougham's masterstroke was not legal, it was political, it was nuclear. He stood before the assembled lords and announced, in measured but unmistakable terms, that he possessed evidence about King George IV's personal life that, if revealed, would cause catastrophic and irreparable damage to the monarchy. He did not need to say the name. Every man in that chamber likely understood the implications of his words. Maria Fitzherbert. The secret marriage of 1785. The illegal Catholic wedding that, if formally acknowledged, would disqualify the king from the throne under the Act of Settlement. The truth that had been buried for 35 years, known to hundreds, but officially denied by everyone. If Brougham revealed the full evidence, if he put the details of that marriage before Parliament and the public, the consequences would be constitutional catastrophe. The legitimacy of George IV's reign could be challenged. The succession could be thrown into chaos. The stability of the British political system, already strained by post-war unrest and radical agitation, could shatter. Brougham was not merely defending a queen, he was holding a loaded pistol to the head of the monarchy itself and daring the lords to pull the trigger. He compared George IV to the Roman Emperor Nero, a tyrant who destroyed his wife's reputation, so that he could cast her aside and take a new one. He argued that the real motivation for the Bill of Pains and Penalties was not morality, but succession. Princess Charlotte, the beautiful, popular, beloved daughter of George and Caroline, had died in childbirth on November 6, 1817, at the age of just 21. She had married Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld in May 1816, and the nation had celebrated as if the future of Britain had been secured. When she became pregnant, the country waited with joyful anticipation. But after more than 50 agonizing hours of labor at Claremont House in Surrey, Charlotte delivered a stillborn son. Several hours later, at 2:30 in the morning, the young princess herself died. Prince Leopold, who had taken an opiate to cope with the stress, was asleep when his wife drew her last breath. When he woke and was told, he reportedly could not speak for hours. The nation's grief was unprecedented. Shops closed, flags flew at half-mast, strangers wept openly in the streets. Charlotte had represented hope, a new generation, a fresh start for a dynasty plagued by scandal and excess. Her death left a gaping hole in the line of succession and triggered a frantic scramble among George III's surviving sons to marry and produce heirs, a race that would eventually produce Queen Victoria. For Caroline, the news was shattering. She was in Italy with Pagani when a courier, traveling to deliver the news to the Pope, happened to pass through Pesaro and mentioned that the princess had died. That was how a mother is said to have learned that her only child was gone, by chance, from a stranger, on a road in Italy. Brougham now argued before the Lords that Charlotte's death was the true catalyst for the Bill of Pains and Penalties. With the heir dead, George needed a new wife and a new child. Caroline was simply an obstacle to be removed. The speech was devastating. Lords who had entered the chamber, prepared to vote against the Queen, began to shift. The government's carefully assembled majority started to crumble, vote by vote, peer by peer. Outside Parliament, London was in uproar. Whenever Caroline travelled to the House of Lords, her carriage was often escorted by cheering, chanting mobs. Cheap broadsheets, the tabloids of the Georgian era, printed many details of the testimony. Satirical cartoons mocked the king and celebrated the Queen. Booksellers couldn't print pamphlets fast enough. One Yale University exhibit would later call the entire episode "Trial by Media," the event that gave birth to modern British tabloid culture and the public's insatiable appetite for royal scandal. The government was genuinely afraid. Guards at the royal stables at Buckingham Palace briefly mutinied. There were fears of wider military insubordination. Ministers worried openly about revolution. When the bill reached its third reading on November 9, 1820, the government's majority had collapsed to just 9 votes. Prime Minister Lord Liverpool made a cold political calculation. It was said this bill would never survive the House of Commons. If forced to a vote there, the government might fall, the public would riot, and Brougham's nuclear threat, the Fitzherbert secret, might finally be detonated. On November 10th, Liverpool announced the bill was being withdrawn. London exploded in celebration. Church bells rang across the country. Bonfires blazed in towns across the country. Crowds danced in the streets of the capital until dawn. Caroline was carried through London like a conquering hero. Even George Canning, one of the government's most senior ministers, had resigned in protest at the treatment of the Queen, further weakening the Tory administration. And Henry Brougham, the sharp-tongued, physically unremarkable Scottish lawyer, who had stood before the House of Lords and threatened to expose a king's deepest secret, was now the most celebrated man in Britain. Caroline had won. The bill was dead. The nation was on her side, but her victory was about to curdle into something far worse than defeat. Because King George IV had not finished with his wife. And what he did next would lead to one of the most dramatic and controversial scenes in the history of the British monarchy. The months that followed Caroline's triumph should have been the beginning of a new chapter. They were, instead, the beginning of the end. George IV may have lost in Parliament, but he still controlled the machinery of the crown. And he used every ounce of that power to ensure that Caroline's legal victory would feel like a personal defeat. In early 1821, the king made his intentions brutally clear. Caroline's name was removed from the coronation liturgy. She would not be crowned alongside her husband. She would not attend the ceremony. She would not be acknowledged as queen in any official capacity. The Whig politicians who had championed her cause in Parliament, sensing that there was no more political advantage to be gained, quietly withdrew their support. Caroline was winning the argument but losing the war. On the morning of July 19, 1821, the day of George IV's coronation at Westminster Abbey, Caroline made one final desperate bid for recognition. She dressed formally, arrived at the Abbey, and approached the great doors. What happened next became one of the most famous scenes in the history of the British monarchy. Caroline called out to the pages, "The Queen, open!" The doors swung open. She stepped forward and declared, "I am the Queen of England." An official, standing just inside the entrance, roared at the pages, "Do your duty, shut the door." And the great door of Westminster Abbey was slammed directly in the face of the Queen of England. Caroline tried other entrances. She moved around the exterior of the Abbey, attempting door after door. Everyone was locked. Everyone was guarded. Inside, the coronation proceeded without her, the most lavish and expensive ceremony in British history, costing roughly £240,000, while the Queen stood outside, rejected, humiliated, and utterly alone. Eventually, with no options remaining, Caroline returned to her carriage and was driven home to Brandenburg House in Hammersmith. The public's sympathy had not entirely vanished, but the cheers were thinner now. The moment of triumph had passed. The very next day, Caroline fell ill. She had been experiencing stomach pains for weeks, but the symptoms now worsened with terrifying speed. Doctors were summoned. Remedies were attempted. Nothing helped. The pain grew worse. Her condition deteriorated by the day. On August 7, 1821, exactly 19 days after the coronation, Queen Caroline of Brunswick died at Brandenburg House. She was 53 years old. The cause of death was never definitively established. It may have been an intestinal obstruction. It may have been stomach cancer. Rumors that she had been poisoned by agents of the king circulated immediately and have never been completely laid to rest. In the febrile atmosphere of Georgian London, anything seemed possible. In her final days, Caroline made two requests that reveal everything about who she was. First, she asked to be buried not in England, the country that had alternately embraced and rejected her, but in her hometown of Brunswick, Germany, where she had been born 53 years earlier. Second, she requested a specific inscription for her coffin plate. It read, "Here lies Caroline, the injured Queen of England." George refused to allow the plate to be attached. Even in death, he would not allow her to claim a title he believed she had never deserved. But Caroline's supporters had one final card to play. When the coffin arrived at St. Peter's Church in Colchester, resting overnight on its long journey to the port of Harwich, her executors secretly screwed the brass plate onto the lid of the coffin in the dead of night. By the time the authorities discovered it, it was too late. The words were fixed in place. Caroline had achieved from beyond the grave what she could not achieve in life. She had named herself the injured Queen, and no one could remove it. The funeral procession, however, was a violent and extraordinary final chapter, marked by riots and military intervention. Lord Liverpool's government planned a route that would deliberately bypass the City of London, hoping to avoid any public demonstration. They underestimated the rage of the people. On the wet, drizzly morning of August 14, 1821, as the hearse, elaborately decorated and drawn by 8 black horses, left Brandenburg House, thousands upon thousands of Londoners poured into the streets. They reportedly blocked many roads the government had planned. They shut the gates to Kensington Gardens, They overturned carts and carriages to build barricades. They chanted with a single deafening voice, "The city, the city, the city or death." The military escort, lifeguards on horseback, carrying weapons they were authorized to use, found themselves surrounded, pelted with stones, and unable to advance. The situation escalated with terrifying speed. A magistrate gave the order. The soldiers opened fire. 2 men were killed. Richard Honey, a carpenter, was shot dead. George Francis, a bricklayer, was shot dead beside him. Several others were wounded. The crack of musket fire echoed through the streets of London on a day that was supposed to be a solemn funeral procession. But the crowd did not disperse. For 7 hours, the mob fought the military escort, forcing the procession off its planned route and into the heart of the City of London. Exactly the path the government had tried to avoid. Caroline's coffin passed through the streets she had been denied in life. The people had given her the send-off that her husband had tried to prevent. Her body was taken to Harwich, placed on a ship, and transported across the North Sea to Germany. On August 25, 1821, Caroline was buried in Brunswick Cathedral, laid to rest in the family vault alongside her ancestors. The coffin plate read exactly what she had requested. "Here lies Caroline, the injured Queen of England." Richard Honey and George Francis were buried the following day at St. Paul's Church, Hammersmith. Thousands attended their funerals, which became yet another public demonstration against the government. Crowds attacked the lifeguards' barracks in Kensington. The violence of the funeral procession directly contributed to the growing call for police reform. And within 8 years, Robert Peel would create the Metropolitan Police, the first professional civilian police force in the world. Caroline's death and funeral had changed Britain, even in dying. And what became of the men who shaped her story? Henry Brougham, the lawyer who had saved a queen and threatened a king, rode his fame to the very summit of British power. In 1819, he had married Mary Ann Spalding, the daughter of Thomas Eden and widow of a Scottish MP. According to those who knew him, Brougham was breaking his marriage vows within months. He was, it seemed, incapable of loyalty to anyone for very long. In 1826, his name appeared in the scandalous memoirs of Harriet Wilson, one of London's most notorious courtesans. Rather than face the exposure, Brougham paid to have the reference removed, buying his silence, the way George IV had tried to buy Caroline's. But his public career was untouchable. In 1830, he was appointed Lord Chancellor, the highest legal office in the kingdom, and created Baron Brougham and Vaux. He was instrumental in passing the Reform Act of 1832, which expanded the right to vote and transformed British democracy. He played a central role in the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which ended slavery across the British Empire. He helped found University College London and the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. He is said to have championed education reform for the working poor. In his later years, Brougham retired to Caen in the south of France, where he became a pillar of the local community, investing in the town's development and hosting visitors from across Europe. He died there on May 7, 1868, at the age of 89. A statue still stands in his honor in the center of Caen today, a memorial to a man who began his career by saving a queen and ended it by helping to build a city. George IV faced scandal, but continued to reign until his death. His reputation, already in ruins before the trial, only worsened. He became increasingly reclusive, enormously overweight, and dependent on laudanum. He avoided public appearances. His own Prime Minister, the Duke of Wellington, reportedly said of him, "He was the most extraordinary compound of talent, wit, buffoonery, obstinacy, and good feeling. In short, a medley of the most opposite qualities, with a great preponderance of good, that I ever saw in any character in my life." It was the kindest assessment anyone could manage. George died on June 26, 1830, at Windsor Castle. He was 67 years old. In accordance with his wishes, he was buried wearing a miniature portrait of Maria Fitzherbert tied around his neck. Even at the very end, in the final moment, he chose the woman who was not Caroline. Maria Fitzherbert herself outlived them all. She died in Brighton on March 29, 1837, at the age of 80. When she was laid to rest, she held a locket containing a portrait of George in her hand. Bartolomeo Pergami, the handsome Italian at the center of the storm, vanished from history. He had been faithful to Caroline throughout their years together, and she had rewarded him with titles, wealth, and the affection of her household. After her death, he withdrew from public life and was rarely heard from again. And the trial itself, it left a legacy that echoes through the centuries. The Queen Caroline affair was the first great media scandal of the modern age, the moment when the British public discovered its insatiable appetite for royal gossip, marital drama, and the spectacle of the powerful being held to public account. Yale University's 2021 exhibition called it Trial by Media, the direct ancestor of every tabloid headline, every paparazzi photograph, every viral moment of royal controversy that has gripped the nation in the 200 years since. When, more than a century and a half later, the marriage of Prince Charles and Princess Diana collapsed in full public view, with secret lovers, media leaks, tell-all interviews, and a nation choosing sides, the commentators reached for the same historical comparison: a prince who loved by the people, a monarchy forced to choose between its traditions and the court of popular opinion. And more recently still, when Harry and Meghan stepped away from the royal family and told their story to the world, the echoes of Caroline's battle rang out again. A royal woman, rejected by the institution, taking her case directly to the people. The dresses change. The palaces are renovated, the newspapers become websites, and the broadsheets become Twitter threads. But the story, an ancient story of power, love, and betrayal, never changes. And that is the story of Queen Caroline and Henry Brougham, a story of a loveless marriage, a ruthless and brilliant lawyer, and a trial that nearly brought down the British crown. Caroline of Brunswick was not a saint. She was reckless. She was impulsive. She was almost certainly guilty of everything the prosecution accused her of, but she was also brave. She refused £50,000 a year to disappear quietly. She stood before a powerful institution and demanded to be seen. She arrived at the doors of Westminster Abbey and called herself Queen, and when the door was slammed in her face, she didn't crumble. She went home and died on her own terms, with her own words inscribed on her own coffin. And Henry Brougham, the sickly boy from Edinburgh who became a formidable lawyer, argued a principle that still resonates today. In the right hands, a secret is more powerful than a crown. A single threat, delivered at the right moment, in the right chamber, to the right audience, can bring a king to his knees. If this story kept you watching, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. We have got more royal scandals coming here on Pure British Scandals that are even more shocking than this one. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think Henry Brougham was a genuine hero who saved a queen from injustice? Or was he a cold-blooded manipulator who used Caroline's suffering to build his own career? I read many comments, and I want to know what you think. Until next time, this has been Pure British Scandals. So,